Learning is a basic and ubiquitous human activity. Society is based on learning, communities are held together by learning, and people construct their identities through learning. Yet, learning becomes problematic in schools, where it's assumed that people or that some people will learn and others won't. And where in schools a place where it's assumed that learning is something that kids will only do under coercion. And when I say kids, I'm referring to anyone from elementary school through, I suppose, graduate school. Teachers and people who work in school view kids' engagement in non-school activities as distracting or a distraction from learning. But the depth of learning that takes place among kids involved in age-specific social activities is unequaled in the classrooms. Unlike much of what's taught in school, the knowledge gained in collecting and, say, trading baseball cards or Hot Wheels or Matchbox cars, people who collect stamps or share music, the learning that goes on with young kids in the playground playing jump rope, Dungeons and Dragons, communities of people all around the world who get together for video games, high performance Monopoly, playing in a garage band, working on cars. This type of learning, in contrast to learning in school, tends to stay with people for the rest of their lives. Adults, especially teachers, tend to view friendships, games, romance, collections, popular music, video games as attractive nuisances that prevent learning. But if the learning energy that goes into these activities went into math or social studies or English or whatever it is, we would have a nation of academic geniuses. In fact, learning becomes problematic in school to the extent that the school focuses on learning as an endeavor itself, rather than a means to building social relations and engaging in meaningful activity. No amount of change in schools will produce significant results unless the nature of school as a social entity is taken seriously. And no amount of clever delivery of subject matter will capture the imaginations and energies of students who feel that their opportunities for social development lie elsewhere. Teachers know better, but while many teachers know better, the organization of our schools currently embodies the belief that kids' social ties and activities are incompatible with learning. But individuals learn in the interest of participation in communities that matter to them. They learn in order to know how to be productive in that community and to gain access to valued forms of community participation. And so the reward is in seeing their contribution, knowing that others recognize their contribution, and forging an ever-changing sense of themselves. So we take this as a given among adults whose work is commonly integrated with their social lives. As just one easy example, scientists mix social and scientific interaction. That's what conferences are all about. And as they mix their social and scientific together, they forge their identities and connections around their work, their knowledge and their contributions to the scientific community. Yet kids in school are expected to function differently. to learn in isolation from the social ties that bind them. In adult scientific communities, just like in kids' jump rope, and garage bands, and World of Warcraft, activity and social relations are closely intertwined. So it's in that sense that I use the term community of practice. So the notion of community of practice was developed by two anthropologists, Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger, as a basis of social theory of learning. Now, they didn't invent community of practice. This is, as I'll describe, they've been around forever. But a community of practice, I want you to think of a community of practice as a collection of people who engage on an ongoing basis in some common endeavor. It could be a bowling team, a book club, a group of friends, a crack house, a family, a church congregation. Now, among sociolinguists, and the construct was brought into sociolinguistics as a way of theorizing language and gender. But we can look at communities of practice both linguistically and non-linguistically. But since people use language to bind them, then a common mode of communication is a determining factor in defining a community participation and identity. This is true for people's first language, and it's certainly true for second language acquisition and even foreign language instruction. So the basic argument made by Lave and Wenger is that communities of practice are everywhere, and that we are generally involved in a number of them, whether it's work or home or civic or leisure interests. And Etienne Wenger wrote, and I'll read this as you can follow along, communities of practice are formed by people who engage in a process of collective learning in a shared domain of human endeavor, a tribe learning to survive, a band artists seeking to new forms of expression, a group of engineers working on similar problems, a clique of pupils defining their identity in the school, a network of surgeons exploring novel techniques, a gathering of first-time managers helping each other cope. In a nutshell, communities of practice are groups of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. Now, in some groups, we're core members of the community. In other groups, we're more at the margins. Over time, Wenger writes, this collective learning results in practices that reflect both the pursuit of our enterprises and the attendant social relations. These practices are thus the property of a kind of community created over time by the sustained pursuit of a shared enterprise. It makes sense, therefore, to call these kinds of communities communities of practice. Now, the characteristics of these communities of practice vary. Some have names, many of them don't. Some communities of practice are quite formal in organization, others are very fluid and informal. But members are brought together by joining in common activities and by what they've learned through their mutual engagement in these activities. So, in that respect, community of practice is quite different from a community of interest or even a geographical community, in that a community in practice involves a shared practice. in a community of practice, people, in a rather egalitarian basis, engage in a whole integrated process involving many functions and roles, which they distribute among themselves and across their tools and technologies, but in overlapping and collaborative ways. And since knowledge is not held in a community of practice by one person, but it's distributed among multiple people. And it's distributed among practices and tools and technologies and procedures. Again, it's not stored in any one head. So the problem of people kind of walking with their knowledge is more or less solved. They're not going to leave. If somebody leaves, the knowledge in the community of practice belongs to the community, not to the individuals. So that, anyway, newcomers, we can talk about them as being apprentice, novices, are in a sense trained by being scaffolded, supported in what we refer to as joint practice with those already adept at a practice. Now, this doesn't happen just through overt instruction. Everyone in the community of practice gains knowledge through immersion in the collaborative practice and knowledge that they may not be able to explicate in words, but which they can pass on through socialization of new members. Within a community of practice, all members pick up a variety of tacit and taken for granted values and norms and models and narratives as part of their socialization into the practice and their ongoing immersion in the practice. So tacit accepting of these values and norms and cultural models and narratives and sharing them with others is just what it means to be a member of a community of practice. So Etienne Wenger talks about the characteristics of community of practice, and I'm going to just, which I've outlined for you, and you can just follow along. He essentially says there are three elements which are crucial in distinguishing a community of practice from other groups and communities. Number one, the domain. A community practice is something more than a club of friends or a network of connections between people. It has an identity defined by a shared domain of interest. Membership therefore implies a commitment to the domain and therefore a shared competence that distinguishes members from other people. Number two, a community. He writes, in pursuing their interests in their domain, members engage in joint activities and discussions, help each other, and share information. They build relationships that enable them to learn from each other. And three, the practice. Members of a community of practice are practitioners. They develop a shared repertoire of resources, experiences, stories, tools, ways of addressing recurring problems. In short, a shared practice. This takes time and sustained interaction. So, a community of practice involves much more than the technical knowledge or skill associated with undertaking some practice. Members are involved in a set of relationships over time, and communities develop around things that matter to people. The fact that they're organizing around some particular area of knowledge and activity gives members a sense of joint enterprise and identity. For a community of practice to function, it needs to generate appropriate and a shared repertoire of ideas, commitments, and memories. It develops various resources such as tools and vocabularies and symbols in a way that carry the accumulated knowledge of the community. In other words, it involves practice, ways of doing and approaching things that are shared to some significant extent among members. And the interactions involved and the ability to undertake larger or more complex activities and projects through cooperation bind people together and help to facilitate relationships and trust. Now, there are two more terms that are associated with community of practice. One is legitimate peripheral participation, and the other is situated learning. So that rather than looking to learning as the acquisition of certain forms of knowledge, you know, the metaphors, I can't absorb anymore, or he sucks all this information in. That's a pretty common notion of what learning is about. But this is a very different understanding of learning. Because what Lev and Wenger have tried to place it in is social relationships, situations of co-participation. As linguistic anthropologist William Hanks wrote in an introduction to their book on legitimate peripheral participation, he wrote that rather than asking what kind of cognitive processes and conceptual structures are involved, the authors ask, what kinds of social engagements provide the proper context for learning to take place. It's not so much that learners acquire structures or models to understand the world, but they participate in frameworks that have structure. Learning, again, is not absorbing information, but it involves participation in a community of practice. And that participation, and I'm going to quote Wenger here, refers not just to local events of engagement in certain activities with certain people, but to a more encompassing process of being active participants in the practices of social communities and constructing identities in relation to these communities. Now, Lev and Wenger illustrate their theory by observing different apprenticeships. They look at Yakati midwives, Vai in Africa, tailors. They look at meat cutters, and they look at the recovering alcoholics in Alcoholics Anonymous. So initially, people have to join communities and learn at the periphery. We all do that. The things that they're involved in, the tasks they may be less key to the tasks they do may be less key to the community than others. But as they become more competent, they become more involved in the main processes of the particular community. They move from legitimate peripheral participation. Think of those words, legitimate peripheral participation. So they move from legitimate peripheral participation into full participation. So learning is not seen as the acquisition of knowledge by individuals so much as a process of social participation. The nature of the situation impacts significantly on the process. Clearly, and you can read the quote by Lev and Wenger yourself, there's a concern with identity, with learning to speak, to act, improvise in ways that make sense in a community. And what's more, and in contrast to learning as internalization, learning as increasing participation in communities of practice concern the whole person, acting in the world. The focus is on the ways in which learning is an evolving, continuously renewed set of relations. In other words, it's this relational view of person and learning. Now, the second term I want to deal with is situated learning. In simply, situated learning is learning that takes place in the same context in which it's applied. This way of approaching learning is more than simply learning by doing or experiential learning. This idea of situatedness involves people being full participants in the world and in generating meaning. So for newcomers, novices, people, legitimate peripheral participators. Levenwenger write that the purpose is not to learn from talk as a substitute for legitimate peripheral participation. It is to learn to talk as a key to legitimate peripheral participation. How am I going to become part of the conversation? And that orientation has the definite advantage of drawing attention to the need to understand knowledge and learning in context. Now, situated learning depends on two key claims. One, it makes no sense to talk of knowledge that is decontextualized, abstract, or general. And two, new knowledge and learning are properly conceived as being located in communities of practice. Now, for obvious reasons, formal educational institutions have been reluctant to embrace these ideas. There has been a very real sense in which the direction of the analysis undermines the reason for being and many of the practices. But there have been some significant explorations of how schooling might accommodate some of these key themes in a community of practice, which you'll be reading about. But to conclude here, I want to highlight three major points that summarize the central tenets, I think, of community practice. Number one, learning is not the acquisition of knowledge, but learning is in the relationships between people. Number two, educators work so that people can become participants in communities of practice. And three, there is an intimate connection between knowledge and activity. That learning is part of daily living. Problem solving and learning from experience are central processes. And educators need to reflect on their understanding of what constitutes knowledge and practice.